Okay, hi Dan. Long time no see. How have you been?
Yes, I've been okay, all things considered. It's nice to see you.
I know, and we're in the middle of this COVID, and you're in New Jersey. How are things on the ground there?
They're a little scary these days. New Jersey now has the second highest number of cases of COVID in the country behind New York.
Wow.
Um, and the latest numbers are scary. There's about a little over 13,000 cases currently in New Jersey, and about 160 or so folks have died. And um,
Mm,
it looks like this is going to be a pretty critical week. Obviously, most of the cases are centered around the New York area, which is the
right.
epicenter here in the United States, as most people know. Um, and the numbers really just continue to grow. And I'm a little nervous about what the next few weeks will look like, um, as far as regulations and those sorts of things. There's sort of a soft quarantine in place in New Jersey,
Mm-hmm.
sort of a non-enforceable set of rules, which suggesting that people just limit any travel to anything that's just critical or essential. That includes even visiting family. Um, so if you have to run to the grocery quickly, that's about it. Otherwise, everyone's just been staying put, and most businesses have been closed. Um, the neighboring cities in Philadelphia and in New York City, almost everything is completely closed. So everyone is working from home. So much like what I think most of the world is seeing
Yeah.
here. Um, but our biggest concern really is the amount of equipment that's available to the medical professionals, whether it's masks or ventilators. There's a shortage of beds in hospitals. So I think right now, even though we expect the cases to increase dramatically the next couple of weeks, most hospitals are already indicating they're at capacity. So we're really concerned with what that's going to look like.
Mm. And I don't know if you saw it. I don't know if you all are having the same problem, but I saw in Miami there's a church that's still engaging in huge gatherings and all this sort of thing. In New Jersey, are you all getting a similar problem with churches and that sort of thing?
Yeah, we're seeing a number of, especially religious communities, that are used to congregating frequently, especially some of the more either Orthodox or religious communities where frequent gatherings are common, especially with multi-generational families where that's a very frequent occurrence. And whether that's now abating, I don't know, but through the period, even just up through last week, where the restrictions were already put in place, many of these communities were still gathering. And not surprisingly, we're seeing higher cases in those
Yeah.
groups. And, New Jersey is the densest state in the country.
Mhm.
So you would expect that that's going to create other problems. But you're right, we've seen that in Florida, some other states as well. And the biggest problem has been the younger generation who initially felt that they weren't going to be susceptible. They continued to gather and meet at parties and other events. And now, of course, the data is showing that that generation is just as susceptible as
That's right.
anybody else. And about half the cases, I think, are now between the ages of 19 and 49. So, the earlier guidance which was given, which I guess gave this younger group the feeling that they could still meet. Of course, now they're seeing otherwise, but unfortunately, it looks like the damage is done, so to speak.
That's something that we actually talked about yesterday. Remember, Margaret? We
Yeah.
were kind of asking ourselves, so 21 is the age when people are allowed to drink in the US, and 18, I guess, is the number when they are allowed to vote, and 16 when they are allowed to drive a car, right? And here, for example, we are now almost like blaming all these youngsters because they're going out and they want to enjoy their lives, and they're not really thinking about how they spread the virus while doing so, even though they don't show any of the infection like signs or anything. But we were asking ourselves, who is the one that is going to be responsible for that? Is it that the young people, because they're allowed to vote, are now also being responsible for taking those actions? Or is it the organizers? are the parents the ones to be blamed, or what's your opinion on it?
You know, I'm sure it's a mix. I have two teenage boys, um, and we've been really restricting their travel and their ability to see friends. And it's a challenge because they're teenagers and they like to hang out with their friends, and they know of other friends that are still getting together despite the warnings and despite the restrictions. And so they ask, well, my friends are getting together, why can't we get together with them? And you know, we've just been, you know, really, really strict about it. But you know, my sense is that's a common everywhere, and that's not limited to just, you know, this community. I think.
Yeah.
You know, kids and younger people, you know, that's just part of their daily routine, and so restricting that and making them aware of the fact that, you know, they're just as susceptible, and you know, whether they catch it or not, they can pass it along to somebody else, is something that, you know, we try to ingrain. But to answer your question, you know, I guess it's a shared responsibility. I do know that there are certain areas within the United States which are more rural, and there was a sense that they're less susceptible. So some of those restrictions don't make sense for them, and they still are getting together. And so I would certainly blame parents in that situation for not imposing some restrictions on their kids. But it's a shared responsibility. There's a lot of misinformation coming from the government here. I think now
Yeah.
there's some more consistency.
Yeah.
But early on, there was just competing information,
Yeah.
wrong information,
Yeah.
and indications that it wasn't going to be too bad, which were just clearly wrong.
The same thing in the UK. You know, there were a few weeks where the leadership gave such, you know, mixed signals as to what to do. You know, the people were like headless for a bit. I think now we're seeing more consistency. But, you know, I just want to jump right into why we are excited about this conversation with you today, Dan, because you are really a leading expert in the area of privacy and data security and information technology. And one of the things that we are seeing, and I think a lot of us who are concerned and looking at the trends that are taking place during this COVID period that we're in, is that we're seeing an increased reliance. I guess we're forced an increased reliance on technology, on communicating via the internet, via the cyberspace. And we need to, it seems as if we need to use it more to connect because of physical distancing. But at the same time, there are all these threats that you know, I know you would know a lot about, and we were excited. Anja and I were excited to have this conversation to really, you know, dive into some of these things with you and help to clarify for those who might be watching and listening some of the issues and maybe steps they could take. You know, as a form of digital self-defense. I don't know. We may not get there in our conversation, but yeah, we're really excited to talk to you about it. And just a little, you know, bit about you. You actually were, you know, in-house corporate counsel in some of the leading technology telecommunication firms globally. Was that Verizon and Comcast? Yes?
Yes.
And then you left recently to work in a law firm and head up there dealing with data security and all of that. What motivated you to make that move? And tell us a bit more about what you're doing right now.
Sure. So initially, the role I was playing both at Comcast and at Verizon was in, as you mentioned, the data security and data privacy spaces. And it was really focused in the communications sector. And Comcast and Verizon were both pretty broad companies in the sense they had a number of different service lines. So in addition to things like providing communication technology, they're entertainment companies as well. They provide content, they provide home security, and home automation technologies as well. So there were really a lot of different privacy and security considerations when looking at all these different product and services lines. For me, what I really wanted to do, based upon just what I was seeing and others were seeing in this field, was to be able to really work with a number of different types of organizations and help them both from an initial proactive standpoint in building their privacy and security programs to help them, just because I was seeing just an amazing increase in the number of risks and issues that companies generally are facing in this area. And then, of course, helping them if there were to be a security incident or some other issue, helping those companies deal with it. And although I was doing that in-house, I wanted to really expand that and do that for a number of other companies, just because I liked the idea of helping a mix of both very small companies who really don't have a lot of in-house expertise in this area, and of course, some larger companies who have much larger attack vectors and risks, just because they are so expansive. So that was really the reason for my move. And Baker Hostetler, the firm that I joined, was really one of the leaders in this area, just a really strong group of people that work in this area. So it really was just a good fit for me. And we work with a tremendous number of companies dealing with security incidents. Last year, there were over 1,000 security incidents that we handled. So we've seen a little of everything at this point.
Right. And so you talking about you had started to see, you guys had started to see an increase in the number of risks to small businesses and medium size and other larger businesses with this data security. So prior to COVID, what would you say were those increasing risks that you saw?
Yeah, so it falls into a few categories. I would say one of the larger issues we see involves companies not securing their data properly. As you mentioned, Margaret, there's just an explosion of different technologies that are available to companies to be able to store and process their data. It's not just done internally. There's cloud service providers, there's vendors. It's distributed across numerous locations. It's a real challenge for any company, whether it's a small or large company, to be able to ensure that the appropriate controls are in place.
Right.
And especially with cloud service providers, companies are really responsible for ensuring that they are configuring these technologies in the right way to prevent third parties who don't have authorization to access that information, to have the controls to prevent that. I would say that's one of the largest issues that we see. Companies just don't put the appropriate controls on, so there's data that's exposed to the internet. Anybody can access it. It can include personal information, financial information, that sort of thing. So that's one big area. Another area involves bad actors who are taking advantage of human error. We've all seen phishing emails. We all get the emails that appear to come from a legitimate source, whether it's your bank, whether it's a healthcare provider, whatever. And the criminals are very good at spoofing these messages to appear legitimate. And whether it's a link that's contained in an email that says you need to update your account, whether it's an attachment that appears to be an invoice, or it appears to be a request for some additional information, tremendous source of malicious code that then gets downloaded onto a user's computer, which can then spread across an organization. Oftentimes what this code will do is gather administrative credentials, usernames, passwords in order to get into a company's systems. From that point, they can either choose to exfiltrate sensitive information. They may try to get additional credentials to be able to access different parts of the network. In many cases, we see ransomware, and that's sort of like the third big area that we see. So they'll use that vector to get into a system. Once they've gotten that authorization, that ability to access sensitive areas of the company, they'll then spend some time, depending upon the sophistication of these organizations, and many of them are very sophisticated. These are very well-funded, well-organized criminal organizations with very smart people, unfortunately, and they'll spend time digging around a company's network into their systems to create as much damage as possible. And ransomware
you use the term ransomware.
Yeah.
But those who may not understand what,
Yeah, let me explain that a little further. So ransomware is a type of malicious software that is designed to encrypt data within an organization with an inability to decrypt it. So effectively, you can have Microsoft Office documents, PDFs, other types of data within a database, financial information, where this malicious software will go throughout the entire network or certain areas of a company's network and encrypt that information and make it unavailable to the organization. And oftentimes what the bad actor will then do is literally send a ransom note. And it'll pop up on a user screen and it'll say your files have been encrypted. You won't be able to access them. If you want to gain access to it, go to this website or email us here, and we'll give you instructions on how to download the decryption key. And by the way, this is going to cost you a certain amount of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Which
I
is
was about to ask you actually. I mean, I come from the field. We deal with blockchain all the time, right? More or less, we don't really do a lot of things with cryptocurrencies, but with the infrastructure, the underlying infrastructure. And I was just about to ask you whether you see any value in that infrastructure, like the whole set, the whole code might actually be used to secure those companies as well. So it's not only that the criminals are using Bitcoins and blockchain for, getting transaction across without being traceable, although we do know that Bitcoin to some extent is actually being traceable. But to some extent, companies might as well use that encryption to make secure infrastructure on their own site. Do you see that happening in practice, or do companies still say, no, we don't really understand the technology that well, let's just go with the traditional side?
The blockchain, yeah.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of existing encryption technologies which companies can use and should use. And they're very effective when used correctly. So whether it's a blockchain-based encryption technology or something that just involves an off-the-shelf product that have been around for a while, the issue becomes when you encrypt data that's sitting on the servers, and that data needs to be used in some sort of production. So if you're running, let's say, some kind of an HR system or a financial system where all that data needs to be processed on a regular basis. Once it's encrypted, in many cases, it becomes more difficult to go through a decryption process, then process that information for whatever function you're doing. And when you're looking at that process at scale, that can greatly slow down an operation. So companies oftentimes will be more reluctant to encrypt certain types of data that's being used on an ongoing basis because it's going to impact productivity, slow down processes, et cetera. And especially if you're dealing with customer information, customers expect to go to a banking website if they want to conduct a transaction or they want to purchase a product. They don't want to wait longer than necessary or what they believe is the right amount of time, right? They want things quickly, they want it done fast, and they don't want to wait for it. So companies are always dealing with that tension. When you've got on one hand, sure, we can invest in security, we can invest in encryption, and that's not hard to do. But on the other side of the equation, if we're going to create a customer experience that's frustrating, then that's a problem too. So if we're losing business because of that, well, that clearly doesn't, do us any good to have all this encryption technology for losing business. So it's kind of finding that middle ground, which is really tough to do for a lot of companies.
Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. The technology, we're going to ever use this novel technology, it needs to be first adopted by the clients as well. We can't just impose it on the company side without actually having a good user experience on the other side. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And with regard to ransomware and all the cybersecurity issues, do you see COVID-19, now that we are all kind of social distancing but migrating towards all these digital platforms, do you see that as an open door to more cybersecurity issues?
Well, we've already started to see it, unfortunately. We're seeing a lot of these criminal organizations take advantage of the pandemic. We're seeing a tremendous number of phishing emails promising cures, promising information about, whether your community's been hit. Click here and you can see, who in your community has been infected, which is enticing. Right now, as we talked about a few minutes ago, there's been a tremendous amount of misinformation. People are hungry for information and data which can help them or their families. So the criminals know this, and they're taking advantage of that. And we're seeing a huge uptick in these types of attacks, promising information about COVID-19 or cures or what have you. And what happens then, of course, it's, as I described, these are really just means in which to gather credentials, usernames, passwords of users to be able to either launch ransomware, to get access to banks or other types of information where they can steal, that kind of information or assets. And, they're also taking advantage of the fact that everyone's working at home. And this is a huge issue because when people are at their offices, typically the company's technologies and security protocols are in place. If I'm working at home, I need to remotely access my company's network to get to whatever systems I need to get to, which means now there's this potential break in the security chain when I'm sitting at home. And as with most folks, they're not going to have the same kind of security architecture and structure that their company does. So whether I'm logging in, I have to use my home Wi-Fi, and I have to authenticate remotely. The attackers can take advantage of that. So we're seeing an uptick now of criminals who are now sending messages to individuals saying, I see that you're trying to log into your computers at work or your system here. Click here and you can, to add your code to get in, which of course is a malicious, fraudulent link, and they'll gather the information. Unfortunately, we're also seeing an uptick, or at least a consistent number of attacks in healthcare organizations, which really we see as the lowest of the low at this point. But again, because of the stressors that healthcare organizations are facing and just trying to deal with the pandemic, criminals take advantage of that as well. And they know that when people are stressed and they're anxious and they've got a million things to do at once and there's patients to deal with, you're not always thinking about avoiding certain links to click on or security protocols because you've got other priorities. You've got patients to help. And so that's also something that's very unfortunate.
That's crazy. Yeah, but how can companies, because most companies right now in non-essential services are allowing their employees to work from home. I know back home where I'm from in Trinidad and Tobago, here in the UK, a lot of that has started. So remote working is, so how can these companies protect themselves with, their employees logging in remotely and the risks that you just identified?
Yeah, well, there's a few things to do. One of the first things is for companies to set up what's called multi-factor authentication, which is a term that many of us are probably familiar with. And this just requires, if you're going to be logging into your company email, or you're logging into a particular system that involves whatever work that you're doing for that company, to require that extra step of authentication. So when you're entering a username and password, to have a code sent to your phone. It's not foolproof. The attackers can get access to that as well, but it's probably one of the better defenses a company can have. And it's surprising that there are numbers of companies, large numbers of companies that still don't have that set up, even in a work from home environment. So that's one generally pretty easy thing to do, and that can knock out a number of these issues right off the bat.
And where do they go to get that done?
It depends on the technology. So a lot of companies use Office 365. That's a very popular email program. That program offers multi-factor authentication. You literally just have to turn it on. So that's an easy one. And most other systems and programs that offer remote access generally will offer this sort of technology. Again, it's up to the company and the IT group to literally put it in place. Right. So that's one thing. Another thing is, beware of any emails or messages, anything that's COVID-19 related. If it looks like it's enticing you to act in some way, to click here to get information, to go to a particular site, general rule is don't do it. There are plenty of websites that you can enter the URL yourself in the browser if you're looking to get information, and don't rely upon a link or information that's contained in an email, even if it looks like it's coming from an official source. So that's one thing. The other thing is there are a number of what are called honeypot websites out there, which are fraudulent, malicious websites that are designed to provide information about COVID-19 or other types of issues associated with it, which are designed also to gather your information and use your credentials to then get into other systems. So try to, as much as anybody can, try to identify legitimate sources based upon other sources out there. Go to existing trusted sources, which will then often provide information to other sites that you can then rely upon. Because right now, you know, like I said, there's just a huge explosion of these malicious and fraudulent sites that are popping up. So those are some things to do. And another thing is, and this is an issue that we see, when companies generally experience a security incident, if something occurs, most companies should have what's called an incident response plan in place. And effectively, this is a document and a policy which will lay out the steps that a company needs to follow in the event an incident occurs, whether it's ransomware, whether it's an email compromise, whether it's information that was left exposed on the internet. And generally that will then provide for a step-by-step process on how to handle it. Well, if everyone's working remotely from home and you have a policy that's designed around the steps to take when everyone is in the same office or you're at your desk and you can go down the hall, how do you manage it if everyone's remotely? How do you manage it if you're relying upon third parties, which otherwise are available when you're in an office environment? So if companies haven't migrated and shifted to that model to reflect the new reality, which is likely to be with us for a while, that's a challenge and that's an issue. And, you know, again, we're starting to see those cracks occur now because incidents are not going to let up just because we're all working at home.
Are you already seeing some changes being adopted in those policies? I mean, are we thinking of the future? Because I'm pretty sure that this is not the first and the last pandemic, right? And maybe it's going to serve us better if we just amend those policies so that if all of a sudden all of the workers needs to work from home, this section of the policy will be applicable. Is that already happening? Are companies already adopting some new things?
Some have done it. Others are struggling just to stay afloat. And this is something that we're seeing, unfortunately, where these are all best practices. These are all important things that companies should be doing. But we'll deal with clients that'll tell us, they'll say, Dan, you know what, that makes complete sense and we need to be working on that. But quite frankly, we're just trying to stay alive right now because, you know, our revenues are down and we have people out of work. And yeah, that makes sense. But all of our resources right now are just trying to keep the lights on. So tough to argue with that. You know, we get it. We understand. So it, you know, it really depends on the resources that a company has, both from a personnel perspective, from a financial perspective. Are you able to hire professionals to help you with that? Or do you want to just devote your funds just to staying alive and making sure that your employees get paid? So, you know, that's a big issue. And
so you see, you know, that's such a good point, Anja, and then what you're saying. And that's why I think now the work that we're trying to do in Future Law with this database of policy responses and all of that, both at the private level and at the public level, is so helpful because, for example, an incident response template could be uploaded there as a best practice, you know, for future use and all that sort of thing. And so that companies that are under this kind of strain at this time, you know, can put things in place for, you know, future pandemics and future issues where they may have to be forced and constrained to do the work from home. But on that point of ransomware and the exposure of your data online, now, I know you referred to yourself as a technologist and a lawyer. What is a technologist, quickly, because I'm just a lawyer and I'm quite, you know, a novice in the context of technology and the jargon. But at the Future Law Collaborative, we are creating this open database where lawyers from all over the world are contributing and tracking local policy responses. What should we be concerned about with respect to our data in this open database? We are doing it on a third, maybe Anja could share a little more about what Notion and what we're doing it on, and then you could advise us on.
Well, Notion is pretty much a website. They already have an app as well. workplace to kind of take place. It's pretty easy to just delegate a lot of tasks to whomever the teammates are to keep track of the progress that the team actually created. If you're familiar with Asana, it might be comparable to that, but it does have quite a lot of features. So
I'm sorry, Asana, is that what you said?
yeah.
Yep, sure.
It's very similar to Asana, but I kind of like it a bit better because it allows you to add more files to it, and it can be easily customized. They also have quite a lot of templates, so this is pretty much why we used it.
So my question really is, what should we be concerned about in respect of security there? Are we relying on Notion security for the data that we put up there? Dan, I don't know if you know, like if you use Asana, right? If you use Asana and these, would it be a cloud-based? Would those be cloud-based? Right. What are we relying on? Individuals using these cloud-based platforms to host our data?
You know, one of the things that happens when we see more of these technologies come out, more of these resources that we can use to store and share information, is what I call data sprawl. So whereas we may have
data sprawl.
SP. What I mean by that is we may be used to keeping our sensitive or personal information in one repository. Whether it's at a law firm, we've got a server where all the information sits, or at a company, you have certain applications that need sensitive information, so they're stored within the application. But we're now in a distributed environment, right? So now we're in a situation where people want to collaborate from different locations. You want to be able to share information. You want to be able to collaborate real time and you know, either display certain information or documents or policies with others and make it an easy process where you don't have to jump through hoops to get to one centralized location within a company that outside third parties can't get to easily. So you see these collaboration tools pop up, and now you have information that used to be in one location potentially stored in lots of locations. So if it's shared on some sort of a collaboration site, well, if that information can then be downloaded from that site, now it can be stored in all sorts of places. So what do? Well, generally what I like to think about is what's called good data governance. What type of information are we comfortable storing in these sorts of tools? If we're talking about policies or other documents that we're okay sharing freely, or at least sharing within a community or an organization, or you know, amongst third parties who are able to use this relatively freely, that's one thing. Well, I'm more concerned about sharing either competitive or sensitive information, whether it's about a client, whether it's about a certain business function which is confidential, and expecting that that confidentiality and security will remain once I share it in one of these collaboration tools. Because we lose control at that point. And if it's out there and there's an ability for a user to then take that information, use it elsewhere, at that point security breaks down. I don't know where it's going. I can't control the flow at that point. So it really comes down to if you are a law firm, or you're running a law firm, or you're running an organization, how are you classifying your data in a way where I know as a user what information I can share on these platforms or tools, and what information has to be stored and kept confidential under those controls such that third parties shouldn't be accessed. And if you don't have that classification scheme, you're not going to know what can be shared and what can't be. I think, Margaret, you mentioned earlier on about privacy legislation and you know, how do we sort of deal with the patchwork of different privacy laws worldwide. It's a challenge because those privacy laws will define personal information, other types of sensitive information in different ways, depending upon the jurisdiction, depending upon the industry that you're in. Some companies are regulated more than others. So unless your company understands which of these laws applies to that company or law firm, and then applying that to the data that you're using in a way where I can classify critical information, maybe medium sensitivity, low sensitivity, putting them in the right buckets and knowing what I can share, then effectively nothing can really be kept confidential because I don't know what the difference is between sensitive information and non-sensitive information, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and so this brings us to a really important thing that's happening, issue that's being raised right now with this pandemic, and that is the privacy of our health data, because governments are saying, well, we need to know where you are, we need to trace you. There's a whole movement we're seeing that we need to know where people are. And so it's even beyond privacy of health data. But then there's also the issue of, if you have corona, the government should know, so that the government can do the contact tracing and protect and soothe and all this sort of thing, others. But should my private health information be put out, to the wider community and country? Where is the line drawn?
Maybe the 4G is still not working well.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, but where is the line
Margaret,
drawn?
if you can hear us, we lost you.
Okay, am I back? Am I back? Am I back?
Yes.
Yeah. So where's the line drawn between the public interest in getting our private health information, and also our geographical location and who we've been with and been around, and our privacy? Where's the line drawn between public interest and privacy?
Yeah, it's a tough one. And, if you look historically at what's happened in previous emergent situations or other crises, you generally see a lot of knee-jerk reactions where legislation's passed or new rules are put in place, which are designed for improving either communications amongst either it's a healthcare professional or the government in general, to be able to tamp down some sort of a crisis, or to be able to provide help to folks that need it. And oftentimes those rules can come at the cost of individuals' privacy. So we need this information from you. We're forcing you to provide this information. We're forcing you to provide your location or your whereabouts, because we need to be able to effectively deal with or remediate the problem, whatever that problem is. And we've seen this throughout history. It doesn't, this is not, specific to the U.S. by any case. But what happens after that is, when those crises end, do those liberties that we've given up, are they returned to us afterwards?
That's right.
And oftentimes the answer is no. So once we've chosen, either because we've elected to make the decision, or whether we've been forced to do it, in the short term, for the short-term good, ultimately, do we return back to then the previous state? And that doesn't always happen. So what we're seeing now is, we have in the United States a law called the Health Insurance Affordability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA.
Yeah.
And in short, what that does is it requires certain privacy and security rules for organizations that handle protected health information, which is the term that's used. And effectively, it's what you'd expect. Anything about your treatment or your health, the benefits you receive, et cetera. So recently, the government here has relaxed certain privacy and security rules to allow for more control by the patient to gain information about their own health. Why? Because you may need to be able to take that information to a different position. Things are fluid, things are happening quickly. I want to be able to make sure I can get this information from my healthcare provider quickly. And I need to be able to do that in a way where I can use different technologies to get to that information. So if a company or a healthcare provider says, look, these rules have been relaxed, so I need to be able to get this information to you quickly, I want to be able to use a Google-based product or a Microsoft-based product, because this is something that is easily accessible by patients. So the question then becomes, well, companies that are typically under this HIPAA rule, which has these privacy and security requirements associated with it, don't typically extend to companies like a Google or a Microsoft. So now what happens to that data once it's sitting in their hands? Or any other company which is not typically subject to these health rules, right? So now I'm using these technologies to gain access to my information so I can share it, or I can give information to my family so they're aware of what my health conditions are. Well, do we have a hole potentially in the privacy rules? Because we know that many of these companies are in the business of sharing data. That's how they monetize, right? And that's how they effectively generate revenue. So what's happening with that information? And can we even return back to the previous state, right, if the information has already been shared?
Already out
So
there.
how do you, how do you put the toothpaste back in the tube, right, at that point? So those are some of the concerns that I'm seeing right now. Margaret, you mentioned contact tracing and potentially using telecommunications companies to gather the data about the geolocation of individuals, to sort of create a heat map to identify, well, these particular geographies have higher cases. And so, hey, look, if anybody leaves that geography, we want to be able to track that so we can determine if there's going to be infection based upon where these individuals go. Yeah, it's tough, right? And so to what extent can we identify that individual? Is it just based upon an IP address or a mobile phone device ID? Or is there more personal information associated with that? Can I piece together different pieces of data with that information to say, yep, this was Dan Pepper, or yep, this was Margaret Rose, that traveled from point A to point B. And I think a lot of people may not be familiar or even aware that these are potential uses of this information.
Would you say that all these new companies, let's say Google and Facebook and whomever provides us with the tools, the digital tools, and previously, then you mentioned that we are using them for the third party authenticators, right? And now we're using them for providing us with the access to, let's say, health information. We're using them for quite a lot of things already. Would you say that all these companies are today also presenting new types of regulators? Because I mean, our country can rely on America to kind of influence the behavior of all these big companies, but we don't really have that influence, do we? And I'm not really sure whether America also has this type of an influence. We know that there's hearings before Senate, but I'm still not sure if that's enough. So I'm kind of having these questions whether we are now starting with new geopolitical era where these big companies are going to take over some of the regulatory control.
Yeah. Well, one of the biggest challenges, that's sort of I would say a potentially lengthy discussion. But what I can say is this, unfortunately, in the United States, there is no one single privacy law that applies across the board, like GDPR in the EU, for example.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, we have a patchwork set of privacy regulations in the United States. Each state has, in some fashion or another, their own data security or privacy law.
Right.
Usually it just relates to security breaches and what are the obligations associated with that. We're starting to see more privacy-based legislation. California is at the forefront of that. A couple other states either have or will soon have their own privacy laws regarding, and what you just mentioned, how that information, how can it be used and shared? But we don't have a uniform set. And so if you're a company, you don't do business in certain states that have those laws, well, then you're not potentially subject to them. And if you are a company that's subject to a number of these different state privacy laws, which ones do you follow? Can you follow all of them at the same time and be compliant with all of them at the same time? We're figuring this out. And there's a huge push in the US, and there has been for a while, but even more so now, to have a federal privacy law which applies across the board. I think it'll happen. I think it'll happen relatively soon. There are bills pending in Congress right now. Unfortunately, this Congress can't seem to agree on anything. So, especially now with this crisis, there is certainly there's not much attention on this at the moment. But I remain hopeful. I think it has to happen because for companies or individuals just to have some level of consistency and understanding of what their obligations are, this affects everybody. Everybody cares about this. It's not a conservative or liberal position. Everybody cares about this. So I think there's a desire to get it done. It's just a matter of when.
And I mean, that's in the US, but this challenge that the pandemic presents, and that the management of our data by these multinational corporations, and I actually call them now transnational corporations, it's a challenge that's greater than one nation state. Do you see movements? Do you see, are you hopeful? Or do you even think it would be a good thing for this particular problem, the management of our data at a global level, that there should be global regulation, some sort of convention dealing with the management of data on the internet?
I think it's going to be hard because there are very many culturally specific considerations. Some cultures are much more free to provide information without restriction. Other countries are much less so. So in areas in the European Union, for example, I know there are countries that people are much more loath to provide certain information about their certain personal habits. If you go to other countries that typically have more restrictive or repressive regimes in place, whether or not it's the desire of the individuals to have their information effectively kept under wraps or not disclosed is unknown. But because you have all these cultural differences about the way in which people view privacy, if I were to ask somebody in Germany or I were to ask somebody in India, for example, what they consider sensitive information, they're probably going to have different answers than what I have.
Yeah, but certainly a minimum standard.
Right.
Certainly.
So how do it's hard to kind of identify a global standard because that standard is going to have to apply to certain types of data. And if every culture is going to have different ideas on what that means, then I think that's a challenge that
But we've already identified at the international human rights level the right to privacy at a particular standard. So I mean, I don't think it's impossible to do it. I agree, it's probably difficult and very challenging, as all these challenges that are greater than one nation state, to have the nation states agree, it's very, very challenging. But because it's challenging, are you saying we should abandon pursuit of it? And then we will always be in a situation where companies can jurisdiction hop in relation to regulations with respect to data, where their servers are in respect of the data.
Yeah, no, I think you raise a good point, Margaret, and we do see those types of international standards being put in place. And in fact, I sit on within a group now that's helping to define a privacy by design standard for the International Standards Organization.
Right.
So you're right. There are ways in which we can approach the issue, and that will then set a standard. You're right, which will then defer to local legislation regarding what is considered personal information. So yeah. I do agree with that, and I think that's a good start, right? Because now at least there's something, whether or not it's binding or enforceable or not. And right now, the ISO standards are not enforceable. Just guidelines and standards, you can choose to follow them or not.
Yeah.
But if we can even just use market forces to encourage organizations to use that instead of having government regulation, and by using that as a competitive differentiator, for example, if I'm a company and I store a lot of information, I can say I abide by this particular standard. Does that put me in a competitive advantage than someone else who doesn't? I think that's not a bad thing.
So it's almost like self-regulation became a huge thing. I mean, previously we were even talking about having a technical point of view and then human point of view when we talk about companies and how do we get ready for epidemics or crises like this one. And the human point of view might actually be part of not really the measures, but like censorship that we can now see with some of the companies like Pinterest, Google, Facebook. All of them are now deleting a lot of posts that are having in their name or in the text the word COVID-19. And this is probably part of the self-regulation. And I'm kind of confused, like, are we now relying on companies to do whatever is in their power to actually do these types of things, to kind of censor us as being their clients, being their users? Or are we relying on our countries to do whatever is in their power to actually regulate the country, the companies?
Yeah, I'm nervous about it too. And I'm seeing now certain, whether it's a post or it's an article or even websites that, aren't, let's say being indexed by Google. So if you're searching for a particular topic, certain websites don't come up because Google has made the determination that these are harmful or, malicious or don't follow their own internal policies. I'm uncomfortable with that and how those decisions are made. And, what kind of oversight is there, and is there enough transparency so that if I'm a user and I believe that that's information I am entitled to read, and I can make my own informed decision about whether or not it's blasphemous or just an untruth, I should have that right to make that decision. And I don't want a company like a Google or a Microsoft to make that decision for me. I get it. I feel that way too. There's certain obvious ones where, if it's clearly promoting illegal activity, okay, that's one thing. But if I'm just expressing a point of view about how I think the COVID-19 pandemic started, and I believe that it was based upon, someone's intentional acts to harm people, I might be completely wrong, but am I not entitled to that? Right?
Right. That brings me to a point. I mean, we're coming to the close of the discussion and all of that, but then you said that, which, I mean, you yes.
Another hour.
Wait. No. You're a technologist. You are a technologist. I am seeing all of this crazy. Let me not judge it as crazy, but I'm seeing a lot of this stuff about 5G and COVID, which I do not understand enough to be able to say that is crap. I've shared it with a couple of people like Anja, who's a little more of a technologist than I, and she was like, that is crap. I think she said that. But what do you think about that? I mean, it's what they're seeing,
Well,
I know.
No, we have only a couple minutes. I could probably spend about an hour on this very specific issue.
Really?
I could potentially put my tinfoil hat on it right at this point and probably talk about potential conspiracy theories about this particular issue for a while.
So it's a conspiracy theory?
What's that?
So it's a conspiracy theory?
Well, I don't know if it's a conspiracy theory or if it's actually based in some truth. I will say that many conspiracy theories generally start with some grain of truth. Whether that has then been debunked later on or whether or not it's still a remaining question that we still haven't answered yet, I think is always there. As it goes to 5G, frankly, I don't know enough about the technology to suggest anything. I do know that historically, I've seen certain situations where certain types of illness has a technology connection in one form or another. Whether that's the case here, I have no idea. But my sense is that's probably where it's coming from because there is some historical reference there.
Margaret, don't jump to conclusions.
I'm not. Come on. I wouldn't at all, which is why.
I might start having some people with dark suits knocking on my door in a minute if I keep
No. I'm not at all. I just wanted to hear more from a technologist. But hey, Dan, thanks so much for spending the time with us to unpack, I think, some of these things that I know are probably quite basic for you, but I hope that it'll be helpful to those tuning in. Any last words you would want to, or guidance, I know you've given a lot in the hour, to companies in terms of protecting their data, individuals logging on, and even maybe national health services, governments with hospitals and data and all of that. Any last words? Yeah.
I think the only thing I would say is, these are really difficult times. Everyone is struggling to make sense of this new normal. We don't know how long this is going to last. There's a lot of anxiety out there, and it's very easy for us to put aside what would typically be a common sense approach to protecting sensitive information or thinking about security because we're worried about our loved ones, we're worried about our own health and what this means for our future, both economically and just from a broader view of what this means for the planet and for all of us. I think it's important for everybody to just use common sense. We talk about these conspiracy theories or these other misinformation campaigns out there, and we're hungry for information. We're hungry for ways in which we can make sense of what's going on around us and how we can help ourselves, our families, and our friends. It's important to not lose sight of the fact that common sense can still play a big role. think about who your sources are, where you're getting for your information from. Be smart, be sensible. Don't fall for things just because you feel desperate and you feel like you really need some information because you're unsure of what's going on. I get it. We're all in that same boat. But that's my parting thought, is just to be as smart as we can, do the right things based upon what we're hearing from trusted sources, and not fall for something just because it appears to be enticing, it appears to have information we haven't seen elsewhere before. That can usually lead to trouble.
Thank you, Dan.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.